of Tanit's cult were more than spiritual figures. They were political actors cloaked in sanctity. While men debated in the council chambers, women whispered in the temple courtyards, and those whispers could shift alliances, marriages, even wars. The cult of Tanit was woven into every level of Carthaginian life. It owned land, collected tithes, and lent money to the state during crises. At its head stood high priestesses chosen from noble families, women who understood both piety and politics. Their duties were sacred, interpreting omens, organizing rituals, and guarding the temple treasures. Yet their influence reached far beyond the altar. When they blessed a military expedition, they did so with authority that could inspire or unsettle an entire city. Many priestesses came from the same aristocratic lineages that produced generals and magistrates. Through them, the temple became an instrument of diplomacy. When a nobleman's wife served in Tanit's service, her family gained divine prestige. Her presence could sanctify alliances or condemn rivals. Letters between trading colonies often began with blessings in Tanit's name, penned or dictated by these same women. The cult's seal was a mark of legitimacy. Even ordinary citizens sought the priestess's counsel. They were believed to interpret dreams and communicate Tanit's will. In times of plague or drought, crowds gathered outside the temple to hear their verdicts, whether to appease the goddess with offerings or to prepare for divine wrath. The voice that emerged from behind the incense curtain could change public policy. Carthaginian men might have ruled the Senate, but they never ignored the temple. The state needed Tanit's favour, and Tanit's favour was channeled through her women. That was the unspoken truth of Carthaginian politics. Behind every treaty and festival, behind every prayer for victory, there was a woman ensuring that divine and civic power remained in harmony. To outsiders, these rituals looked like superstition, but to Carthage, they were strategy. The women of Tanit understood something their enemies did not. A city guided by the goddess's voice could not be conquered by sword alone, only by silence, when her priestesses were no more. Carthaginian men went to war for empire, but they were raised by women forged in discipline. The mothers of Carthage were both tender and relentless, for they lived in a city that worshipped strength as much as fertility. Every son was a potential soldier, every daughter a future keeper of Tanit's rights. It was said that Punic mothers did not cry when their sons went to battle. They only prayed that they would return victorious. Childhood in Carthage was an education in endurance. From an early age, boys were taught the virtues of silence, self-control, and devotion to the gods. Their mothers oversaw these lessons as strictly as any tutor. A lazy child could expect not indulgence, but correction. To raise a weak son was a dishonour, both to the family and to Tanit, who valued courage above comfort when war came, and it always did. The women of Carthage prepared their homes like fortresses. They packed supplies, gathered offerings, and made sacrifices for safe return. But when the news of defeat arrived, as it did after the Battle of Himera or the long Roman sieges, they bore it with the same dignity as victory. "Do not weep," an ancient proverb recorded by Roman chroniclers declared. Give thanks that he fought as a Carthaginian. Some women went further still, accompanying armies as attendants and healers, or rallying the population during invasions. When the Romans besieged the city in the final Punic War, it was the women who cut their hair to weave ropes for catapults and melted their jewellery for weaponry. The chronicler Appian wrote that they toiled beside slaves and soldiers alike, their fury a match for flame. The cult of Tanit blessed such defiance. To serve the goddess was to embody resilience, to birth, nurture, and, if needed, to sacrifice for the greater good. Every Carthaginian woman carried a spark of that divine defiance within her. They were the unseen commanders of courage, shaping the spirit of a people who refused to kneel until the city itself turned to ash. And even then, as Rome claimed victory, their legacy whispered on. Mothers who birthed warriors, priestesses who defied empires, and daughters who carried the son of Carthage in their hearts. When Rome's legions finally closed around Carthage, it wasn't generals who faced the last dawn, it was the women. Their husbands were dead or away at sea, their sons too young or too wounded to fight, but the daughters of Tanit did not kneel. As the siege dragged on, they took up the roles once reserved for men, smelting weapons, carrying stones to the ramparts, and standing shoulder to shoulder with slaves and priests in defence of their city. Ancient chroniclers, even hostile ones, could not ignore their courage. Appian described them melting their bracelets and earrings to forge arrowheads. Others told of mothers who refused to flee, choosing instead to guard the temples where Tanit's fire still burned. Inside those sanctuaries, the priestesses prayed, their chants mingling with the distant thunder of Roman siege engines. The scent of incense and blood filled the air, an offering to the goddess of protection in the city's final hour. When the walls were breached, the battle turned to ritual. Women carried statues of Tanit through the burning streets, their robes soaked in ash and tears. They sang hymns not of surrender, but of remembrance, calling upon the goddess to preserve Carthage's spirit beyond ruin. Some set fire to the temples themselves, rather than see them defiled. Flames rose higher than the harbour towers, consuming marble and cedar, but also sanctifying them, transforming destruction into devotion. To the Romans, it was conquest. To the survivors, it was consecration. Even as they were led away in chains, Carthaginian women carried fragments of Tanit's symbol, the triangle, the circle, the outstretched arms, carved on bits of stone or pressed into clay wherever they went. Numidia, Sicily, Iberia, the cult endured. They became the silent missionaries of a fallen city, whispering prayers to Tanit beneath foreign skies. The goddess had promised protection, and in a way, she kept it. Carthage died, but her women ensured she would never be forgotten. Their courage outlasted the flames, their faith outlived empire. Long after the ashes cooled, travellers still found Tanit's symbol carved on desert stones, the eternal mark of women who, in the face of annihilation, chose to burn as offerings rather than bow as slaves. Before her name echoed through Roman nightmares, Boudica was a queen and a mother, ruling a misty corner of Britain under Rome's thin veil of peace. Her people, the Iceni, lived among oak groves and stone circles, proud descendants of warriors who painted their bodies blue with woad and worshipped the spirits of the land. When the Roman Empire swept across Britain, it did not conquer the Iceni by sword, but by treaty. Her husband, King Prasutagus, agreed to rule as a client king, a puppet allowed to wear a crown so long as he bowed to Rome's will. For a time, it worked. Trade flourished, Roman coins gleamed in British hands, and Roman merchants filled Iceni markets with wine and glassware. But beneath the surface, resentment festered. The Romans imposed taxes, built roads for their legions, and sneered at Celtic customs. To them, the Britons were barbarians, wild and backward, unworthy of dignity. Boudica saw the truth. Their alliance was nothing but a leash made of silver. When Prasutagus died around the year 60 CE, he tried to safeguard his people the only way he could, by leaving his kingdom jointly to his daughters and to Emperor Nero. It was a gesture of loyalty, a political insurance policy. But Nero's agents ignored his will entirely. They descended on Iceni lands like vultures. The Roman governor confiscated property, stripped nobles of their rights, and demanded repayment of fictitious debts. Boudica, now widowed, dared to protest. For her defiance, she was publicly flogged. Her daughters, still young, were brutally assaulted by Roman soldiers. The Iceni were enslaved, their fields seized, their sacred groves burned. What was meant as punishment became prophecy. Boudica rose from the dust not as a humiliated widow, but as an avenger. Her pain turned to fire, her shame to strategy. The Romans thought they had crushed a woman. Instead, they had awakened a storm. She gathered her people and called upon the neighbouring tribes, the Trinovantes, the Cornovi, and others long oppressed. In secret councils beneath sacred oaks, she swore vengeance before the gods. The legions of Rome would pay in blood for every lash, every insult, every tear. Britain would burn, and she would lead the fire. Rome's arrogance was its undoing. Across the province of Britannia, resentment simmered like peat fire beneath wet soil, hidden but unstoppable once ignited. The tribes had endured years of humiliation, their land confiscated, their warriors disarmed, their gods mocked by stone-faced invaders who built temples to emperors instead of spirits. All it needed was one spark, and Boudica, scarred but unbroken, struck the flint. The Iceni rose first. Farmers abandoned their ploughs and took up spears. Blacksmiths melted Roman ploughshares into blades. Boudica rode among them, not as a queen robed in luxury, but as a warrior draped in furs and bronze. She raised her spear to the sky and called upon Andraste, the Celtic goddess of war. According to legend, she released a hair from her cloak before the first battle, a sacred omen, and when it ran toward the Romans' doom, her warriors roared in frenzy. Word spread swiftly. The neighbouring Trinovantes, long brutalised by the Roman colony at Camulodunum, modern Colchester, joined her. So did the men and women of distant tribes who had suffered under Roman taxation and forced labour. The rebellion swelled like a tide. In every village, drums sounded and fires blazed on hilltops, signals of defiance carried by smoke across the horizon. Meanwhile, Rome was unprepared. The governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was far away campaigning in North Wales, crushing the Druids on the island of Mona. With the legions occupied, only a handful of officials remained to guard the Roman settlements in the east. They laughed off the reports of Celtic unrest. After all, what threat could a grieving woman pose to the most disciplined army on earth? Then came the first strike. Boudica led her army, some estimate over 100,000 strong, straight to Camulodunum, the symbol of Roman oppression. The town's colonists were veterans who had stolen tribal lands and built a temple to the deified Emperor Claudius, demanding the locals pay for its upkeep. To the Britons, it was not a temple. It was an insult carved in stone. When Boudica's warriors descended upon it, the Romans had no walls, no reinforcements, and no mercy waiting for them. The rebellion had begun, and Britannia would never be the same again. The Roman colony of Camulodunum was the perfect target, bloated with arrogance and undefended. Built on stolen Iceni and Trinovantian land, it was meant to showcase Rome's civilization to the barbarians. Paved streets, marble statues, and a grand temple dedicated to Emperor Claudius. To the Britons it was a fortress of their humiliation. To Boudica it was the first name on her vengeance list. As dawn broke, the ground trembled with the march of thousands. Boudica's army advanced through the fog, a living forest of spears and painted faces. The Roman veterans inside laughed at first. They had walls, they thought. They had discipline. What they didn't have was an army. For time, most of the garrison had been withdrawn to Wales, leaving behind aging soldiers and terrified colonists. Their cries for reinforcements went unanswered. When the Britons struck, they struck like thunder. The Temple of Claudius became the Romans' last refuge, its marble columns blackened by fire. For 2 days, the defenders held out, praying for the legions to appear on the horizon. None came. Boudica's warriors tore down the gates and stormed the sanctuary, slaughtering every survivor. Statues of emperors were toppled, their faces smashed, their bronze melted down to forge new weapons. The city's streets ran red. Camulodunum burned for days. The air filled with smoke and the scent of scorched cedar from Roman villas. The Britons razed everything. The forums, the baths, even the markets. To them, this was not mere revenge. It was purification. The land was being cleansed of Rome's arrogance, its foreign gods, its false order. When the flames finally died, nothing of Rome remained but ash and ruin. Messengers fled to Londinium, warning of the destruction, but their words carried more than panic. They carried a legend. The story of a woman who had defied Rome and won. Even Emperor Nero's officials trembled when they heard her name. The procurator Catus Decianus fled the province in disgrace, leaving the survivors to fend for themselves. For the first time, Rome's iron image cracked. A Celtic queen had turned an entire Roman city to dust, and her army, still chanting her name, was already marching toward the next Londinium would be next to burn. News of Camulodunum's fall spread faster than any Roman courier could ride. Smoke blackened the eastern sky and panic swept through the province. The young city of Londinium, a bustling trading hub on the Thames, braced for what everyone now feared. Merchants packed their wares, Roman officials fled, and the civilians who stayed prayed that the legions would arrive before the red-haired queen did. They didn't. When Governor Suetonius Paulinus finally heard of the uprising, he raced back from Wales with a single legion, far too few to face Boudica's swelling host. He reached Londinium first, and surveyed its wooden streets and merchant stalls. He knew what was coming. To his officers, he gave a brutal order: abandon the city. It could not be defended. Those who stayed would die. They did. Boudica's army descended upon Londinium like a storm from the north. Her warriors poured across the riverbanks, torches in hand, eyes painted black. The city was young, rich, and utterly unfortified, a symbol of Roman greed sprouting from stolen soil. Boudica offered no quarter. Roman settlers, traders, slaves, all were swept away in the fury of her vengeance. The streets became rivers of flame. Archaeologists centuries later would find the scar of that day, a layer of red ash beneath London's modern streets, still known as the Boudican destruction horizon. Beneath it lay shattered pottery, charred beams, and the twisted remains of those who couldn't escape. To her warriors, the burning of Londinium was justice to Rome. It was terror. Reports reached Nero that an entire province might be lost. The empire that had crushed Gaul, Greece, and Egypt now trembled before a Celtic queen. Yet in victory, Boudica's rebellion grew heavier. Her following swelled to nearly 200,000. Tribesmen, farmers, even slaves freed from Roman chains. But with numbers came chaos. Discipline faltered, supplies dwindled, and the brutal vengeance that had begun as liberation began to consume itself. Still, Boudica pressed on. Her fury was not spent, and another Roman town awaited, Verulamium, the prosperous settlement that had once called her people savages. The fires of rebellion were not yet done with Britain. The Queen of the Iceni was still riding, and behind her, the island itself seemed to rise. After Londinium's ashes cooled, the rebellion's fury turned north toward Verulamium, modern-day St. Albans, a Romanized town built on the ruins of old tribal lands to Rome. It was a symbol of progress and civilization. To Boudica, it was another wound carved into Britain's flesh. Her warriors, swollen now to hundreds of thousands, advanced across the countryside like an unending tide. Villages that had once bowed to Rome now raised her banner. Verulamium's citizens had heard the rumours. They had seen the smoke on the horizon and the refugees who stumbled into their streets with stories of slaughter. Still, many believed the walls would hold, that Roman authority, even in absence, would protect them. It did not. When the Britons arrived, there were no legions, no reinforcements, and no mercy. Boudica's army descended upon the town at dawn. Roman villas, once symbols of comfort, became pyres. Her soldiers showed no distinction between colonist and collaborator. Every Roman ally was an enemy. The fury that drove them was not blind chaos. It was generational rage. For decades, their families had been enslaved, their lands confiscated, their gods desecrated. Now, with their queen at the front, vengeance took form in fire. Flames engulfed the city. The sound of timber collapsing under heat mingled with the battle cries of warriors. Roman chronicles later called it a massacre. But to the Britons, it was justice repaid in equal measure. The smoke rose high enough to be seen for miles, a signal to all tribes still hesitating. Rome could bleed. When word of Verulamium's fall reached Suetonius Paulinus, he finally grasped the scale of the catastrophe. 3 major settlements, Camulodunum, Londinium, and now Verulamium, had been erased. The death toll numbered in the tens of thousands. Nero's advisors whispered of abandoning Britain entirely. The empire, for all its power, had been brought to the brink by a single woman. But victory came at a cost. Boudica's vast army was now burdened by plunder, its ranks undisciplined and its supplies strained. The rebellion's unity began to waver. Suetonius, hardened and calculating, saw his chance. He would not strike a burning city. He would strike the fire-starter herself. The final reckoning was near, and both Queen and Empire prepared for the storm to break. Boudica's army no longer moved like a tribe. It moved like a nation reborn in fury. Columns of warriors stretched for miles across the English countryside, drums echoing through the valleys. The Queen rode in a chariot drawn by 2 horses, her daughters beside her, the scars of their suffering visible reminders of why they fought. Her hair streamed like fire in the wind, her spear glittering like lightning under the grey British sky. To her followers, she was not merely human, she was Andraste's living incarnation. Yet with every victory, her host grew harder to control. Tribes that once fought side by side now quarrelled over loot. Boudica tried to command unity, but her warriors were farmers and hunters, not soldiers. They had no training, no supply lines, and little patience for Roman tactics. The countryside they marched through was stripped bare. Roman villas and temples lay in ashes, but the destruction left them with nothing to eat but what they could scavenge. Still, the Queen pressed forward. Her momentum was her greatest weapon, and she knew Rome would soon strike back. Governor Suetonius Paulinus had regrouped. From the ashes of defeat, he gathered what remained of the legions, veterans of the campaigns in Wales, disciplined and furious. They numbered only 10,000, but they were soldiers forged by Empire. Suetonius moved swiftly, marching through the ruins of the rebellion, determined to corner Boudica before her army could disperse. As she advanced westward, scouts brought word. The Roman legions had been sighted, forming ranks near a narrow defile somewhere along Watling Street. Boudica halted her army and called a war council. Her chieftains urged attack. They believed the gods were still with them. "This is the moment," she said, "when we prove whether we are slaves or free." The next morning, her army assembled before dawn. Men, women, and even children who had followed their families into rebellion. Behind them, wagons formed a great circle, filled with plunder, prisoners, and families who had come to watch Rome fall. But Suetonius had chosen his ground well, a narrow valley flanked by forest, with only one way in and none out. The Queen's fury had brought her this far. The battle that awaited her would decide if her name would echo in victory or in vengeance. When dawn broke over the hills near Watling Street, the air was thick with mist, and with destiny. Before her, Boudica saw the narrow valley where the Romans had chosen to make their stand. To her, it looked like a trap. To Suetonius Paulinus, it was salvation. His legions were outnumbered 20-1, yet his discipline was iron, his position perfect. Forests shielded his flanks, and a single road funneled the rebels into the jaws of the empire. Boudica rode before her troops in a chariot, her daughters standing beside her. Ancient writers claimed she spoke with a voice like thunder. "We fight not for gold or conquest, but for freedom, for our children, our gods, and the land that bore us. Let the men of Rome learn that a woman can lead an army, and that tyranny has an end." Her warriors roared in answer. Behind them, their families and wagons formed a massive ring, cutting off any hope of retreat. When the Britons charged, it was as if the entire island had risen. Their cries shook the trees, their chariots thundered forward, but Rome waited. The legions stood shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, their discipline cold as iron. At the last moment, the Romans hurled their pila, heavy javelins that tore through shields and flesh. The first ranks of Britons collapsed, tripping those behind. Still, they came on, crashing against the Roman wall like waves against a cliff. Then Suetonius gave the order, "Advance." The legions surged forward in tight formation, stabbing with short gladi, every motion drilled by years of war. The Britons, trapped by their own wagons, had nowhere to fall back. Panic spread. What had begun as a tidal wave of vengeance turned into chaos. By sunset, the valley was silent except for the groans of the dying. Tens of thousands of Britons lay dead. The Romans lost only a few hundred. The rebellion that had nearly shattered an empire ended in blood and smoke. No one knows what became of Boudica. Some say she poisoned herself rather than be taken captive. Others claim she vanished into the forests, her spirit forever haunting the mists of Britain, the queen who dared to defy Rome and became legend. The battlefield at Watling Street was a graveyard of broken spears and silence. The smell of iron and smoke hung over the valley, where dreams of freedom had died. The Romans, methodical even in victory, buried their dead and burned the rest. To them, it was a triumph, order restored, rebellion crushed. To the Britons, it was a wound that would never heal. Boudica herself was nowhere to be found. Some said she poisoned herself, refusing to be paraded through Rome in chains like a trophy. Others whispered she fled into the forests, vanishing into legend. Her daughters, too, disappeared from the record, their fates left to the mists. The Romans didn't bother to record her burial. For them, the rebellion was over, but for her people, the queen became a ghost that never stopped riding. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, ruthless in his victory, continued to punish the tribes. His soldiers ravaged the countryside, slaughtering anyone suspected of aiding the revolt. Entire villages were burned, and the survivors enslaved. The same fields that had once grown barley and oats for Boudica's army now grew wild and untended, haunted by memory. Even Emperor Nero, hearing of the devastation, considered withdrawing from Britain altogether. The cost of empire, he realized, was higher than gold could measure. Yet in defeat, Boudica achieved what no warrior before her had. She forced Rome to hesitate. For the first time, the empire questioned whether its reach had grown too far. In the years that followed, Roman governors ruled Britain with newfound caution. They rebuilt roads and cities, yes, but they also built statues of local deities, honouring Celtic gods they had once mocked. Fear had taught them respect. Among the tribes, songs replaced swords. Bards sang of the flame-haired queen who rose from humiliation to challenge the world's greatest power. Her story spread from campfires to chronicles, growing with every telling. She was no longer just a woman or a warrior. She was an idea. Even Rome, centuries later, could not erase her name. The empire she defied has long turned to dust, but the legend of Boudica, the queen who dared to fight Rome, still burns, fierce and unbowed, in the heart of history. The flames of Boudica's rebellion eventually died, but her legend refused to. Rome may have won the battle, but they could not erase the memory of the woman who had shaken their empire to its core. In the years following the uprising, the Romans rebuilt their towns, paving new roads over the bones of the fallen. Yet every soldier stationed in Britain remembered her name, the queen who made even Emperor Nero tremble. For the tribes, Boudica became more than a queen. She became a symbol of freedom, vengeance, and unyielding defiance. Around fires on misty nights, storytellers spoke of her hair like flame and her eyes like storm clouds, of the day she rose against the conquerors and nearly broke their iron rule. To her people, she had not died, she had ascended, a warrior spirit forever watching over the green hills of Britain. Roman chroniclers, though enemies, could not help but immortalize her. Tacitus wrote of her courage and eloquence. Cassius Dio painted her as both terrifying and majestic. Even in their words, meant to warn others, she emerged as something more than mortal. A living contradiction, brutal and noble, fierce and just. The conquerors had made her a martyr, and martyrs never fade. Centuries later, as Rome's power decayed, Boudica's story endured in whispers and manuscripts, resurfacing whenever tyranny returned to Britain during the Renaissance. She re-emerged in art and poetry. Not as a relic of barbarism, but as the first mother of British freedom. When the Victorians rediscovered her, she was reborn as an icon of empire. The irony lost on those who once ruled as Rome had. Today, a bronze statue of Boudica stands by the Thames, her chariot drawn by rearing horses, spear lifted high. Tourists walk past it, unaware that beneath their feet lies the very ash layer, the Boudican destruction horizon, marking where she burned London to the ground. Her rebellion failed, but her message did not. She proved that even the mightiest empire could be shaken by the will of one woman. Her victory was not measured in cities conquered, but in courage remembered. And so Boudica rides on, through history, through myth, and through every soul that refuses to bow to oppression. Before the borders of kingdoms and empires, the highlands of Dardania stood as a world unto themselves, a landscape of stone ridges, deep valleys and silver rivers cutting through what is now Kosovo and northern Albania. Here, the Illyrian tribes lived close to the earth and sky, their lives shaped by the rhythm of the mountains. Winters were long and fierce, but spring brought a transformation. The thawing of rivers, the blooming of mountain flowers, and with it, the call to gather. The Dardanians were not a single tribe, but a brotherhood of many clans. Shepherds, hunters, and warriors, bound by shared ancestry and language. Though each tribe had its own chieftain and customs, once a year they became one people. From all directions, families and warriors journeyed to the great gathering fields, high plateaus surrounded by forests and sacred stones. For them, this was more than a celebration. It was a renewal of unity, an offering to the gods who guarded fertility, war, and the harvest. As the festival approached, the valleys came alive. Herds of cattle and goats were driven toward the meeting ground. Women carried baskets filled with barley, cheese, and honey, while men hoisted amphorae of fermented drink. Smoke from distant hearths began to merge into a single column over the horizon, the sign that Dardania was awakening. At the heart of it all stood the altar of the gods. Offerings were made to Depatur, the Illyrian sky father, and to Prende, the goddess of love and fertility. Priestesses lit the first flames of the sacred fire, a signal that the festival had begun. Around them, warriors painted their faces with ochre and ash, preparing for contests of strength, while elders recited ancient verses passed down through generations. For a few days, the rivalries of the tribes vanished. Spears were set aside, trade was conducted freely, and laughter echoed through the hills. Music filled the air, drums, flutes, and stringed lyres made from goat sinew, each note a reminder that the Dardanians celebrated not only survival, but the joy of being alive. In this mountain cradle, surrounded by gods and kin, the spirit of Dardania burned bright, fierce, and eternal. As the first warmth of spring swept across the valleys, messengers rode through the highlands to announce the festival's coming. Horns sounded from hilltops, echoing from one settlement to the next, carrying the same message. The time of gathering had come. The Dardanian tribes, scattered across the rugged terrain of what is now Kosovo and northern Albania, began their great migration toward the sacred meeting grounds. Families packed their wagons with barley bread, smoked meat, and amphorae of wine. Warriors polished their bronze weapons until they gleamed in the sunlight, not for war, but for pride. From every valley, clan banners fluttered in the wind, woven with symbols of wolves, eagles, and serpents, each representing an ancient bloodline. It was a sight that turned the mountain passes into rivers of colour and song. The tribes converged at the great plateau near the sacred hill of Ulpiana, where the earth was said to breathe with divine power. There, elders built stone circles and lit torches that burned day and night. The sound of drums began long before the first feast, deep, rhythmic, and primal, a heartbeat that called every Dardanian home. The gathering was not merely celebration, it was diplomacy. Chieftains from rival clans met face to face, exchanged gifts of silver and horses, and renewed their oaths of kinship. Marriages were arranged to unite families, and disputes that had simmered through winter were settled beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. At night, the fires multiplied. The mountains glowed red under the stars as bards sang of Dardanian heroes, warriors who had defied Macedonian kings and fought for Illyrian honour. The music was unending, wooden flutes, goatskin drums, and the strumming of lyres carved from bone. Dancers moved in circles, their feet striking the earth like rain, while young men competed in strength and agility to win the admiration of priestesses and maidens. For those few sacred days, Dardania was not divided by clan or valley. It was one people, bound by tradition, fire, and song. In those gatherings, the tribes remembered who they were, not subjects of foreign kings, but children of the mountains, keepers of the old gods, and heirs to an unbroken legacy of unity. At the heart of the Dardanian festival burned the sacred flame, the living spirit of the land, believed to carry the breath of the gods. Before the games, before the feasts, the first duty of the tribes was to awaken that flame. It was no simple fire. It symbolized the bond between heaven and earth, tribe and ancestor, god and mortal. At dawn, priestesses in white linen robes walked barefoot through the dew-covered grass, carrying torches from their village hearths. Each flame came from a different valley, some from the Drin, others from the plains of Kosovo-Polje or the shores of Lake Ohrid. They met at the central altar, a stone platform ringed with carved spirals and sun symbols. There, the flames were merged into one, the fire of Dardania. The lighting of the flame was the most solemn moment of the entire gathering. Silence fell over the thousands who watched. As the torches touched, smoke rose in spiraling columns, drifting toward the sky like prayers. The high priestess, usually an elder woman from a royal bloodline, raised her hands and called upon the gods. Depatur, lord of the sky, and Prende, goddess of fertility and love. She spoke words older than memory, blessings for the herds, the fields, and the warriors who would soon test their strength. Once the sacred fire blazed high, the silence broke. Horns sounded from the hills, and the people erupted into song. Each tribe took turns offering gifts: milk, honey, barley, and wine. Animals were led forward for sacrifice: sheep, goats, or doves, chosen for purity. Their blood consecrated the ground, binding the tribes in shared faith. Throughout the festival, this flame was never allowed to die. Young women took turns keeping watch through the night, feeding it with resin and oak branches. To let it fade was to insult the gods, a curse that would bring famine and disease. When the gathering ended, the fire was divided again. Each clan carried a portion home in clay lamps, ensuring that every village in Dardania shared the same divine light. The sacred flame was more than ritual. It was identity. It reminded every Dardanian that no matter how distant their valleys, they all burned from the same eternal source. Once the sacred flame was lit, the time of feasting began, a celebration as ancient as the mountains themselves. Food was not merely sustenance here, it was a sacred act, a symbol of abundance and gratitude to the gods. Every clan contributed from their stores: smoked lamb wrapped in aromatic herbs, flatbreads baked on stone, honey cakes, and amphorae of dark Illyrian wine that shimmered crimson in the firelight. At the centre of the great camp stood long wooden tables carved with tribal symbols. The elders were seated first, followed by chieftains, warriors, and finally, the youth. It was a social order reflected in every bowl passed and every toast raised. Before the first bite, the high priestess poured wine upon the ground as an offering to the ancestors, a silent tribute to those who had feasted before them and watched from the stars above. Music guided the meal. Flutes and drums played steady rhythms, while bards recited the songs of the hills, poems praising the unity of Dardania and the valour of its people. Between verses, laughter rolled through the crowd as stories of hunts, raids, and great loves filled the air. Even rival chieftains shared cups, their old grievances washed away by the warmth of mead and the promise of peace, at least until the festival ended. As night deepened, the bonfires multiplied. Shadows danced on stone circles as dancers moved in great spirals, men and women weaving together, stamping their feet in rhythm with the drums. Every movement was both art and ritual, a reenactment of the harmony between earth and sky. Above them, the constellations were named aloud, each star tied to a legend of the Illyrian gods. Children watched wide-eyed as jugglers and storytellers performed by torchlight. Nearby, hunters roasted game over open flames, while women ground barley for the next day's feasts. The scent of smoke, meat, and pine filled the night air. The feast of the tribes was more than indulgence. It was renewal. Each shared meal reaffirmed the kinship that held Dardania together, even through war and hardship. For one sacred night, every Dardanian, chieftain, shepherd, and smith alike, dined as family beneath the eternal fire and the forgiving eyes of their gods. When the feasting ended, the fires burned lower and the songs turned to chants. It was time for the games. The Dardanian festivals were not complete without the contests that tested the body, spirit, and pride of the tribes. These were no idle spectacles. They were sacred rituals meant to honour the gods of strength, fertility, and war. At dawn, the chieftains gathered their warriors in the open fields below the sacred hill. The drums began again, slow, steady beats that grew faster as the crowd gathered. The air buzzed with energy. Banners waved in the wind as the high priest raised a torch and declared the games open in the name of Eng, the Illyrian god of thunder and valour. The first competitions were of pure strength. Men wrestled on the grass, oiled in animal fat to make their grips slippery, their muscles glistening in the sun. The victor was not the one who struck hardest, but the one who remained on his feet longest, a symbol of endurance, a trait every warrior prized. Then came the spear throw, where hunters hurled their weapons at wooden targets painted with wolf heads. The farthest and truest throw won not only prizes of meat or silver, but the admiration of the women who watched from the terraces. Next came the chariot races. Young men drove horses around marked tracks, the wheels kicking up dust that shimmered in the sunlight. The cheering was thunderous, for the Dardanians believed the gods rode alongside their horses, guiding the swiftest to victory. Those who fell or crashed were carried from the field with reverence. They were said to have been touched by Eng. Women, too, took part in their own rites of skill and grace. Weaving contests displayed artistry, while dance competitions honoured Prende, goddess of love and renewal. Each victory, whether in strength or beauty, was celebrated as a divine gift by sunset. Garlands of oak and laurel crowned the winners. They stood before the sacred flame, lifting their prizes high as the crowd chanted their names. For the Dardanians, these games were more than sport. They were proof that courage, skill, and unity could outlast even the mountains that sheltered them. When the games ended and the dust of the arena settled, another kind of contest began. One not of muscle or might, but of spirit. Music was the soul of Dardania, and no festival could pass without the sound of drums, flutes, and voices rising into the mountain air. As night fell, the warriors laid down their spears, and the bards stepped forward, carrying the stories of their people in melody and verse. The music began with rhythm. The deep, steady pulse of frame drums made from goat hide stretched over oak rings. Their beat echoed through the valleys like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Then came the flutes, carved from bone or elder wood, filling the air with wild, spiralling notes that seemed to mimic the call of the wind over the ridges. Women joined with tambourines, their bracelets jingling in time, while singers gathered in circles, voices weaving together in haunting harmonies that could stir both tears and laughter. The songs told of heroes long gone, warriors who had defied Macedonian kings, hunters who tamed wolves, lovers who crossed rivers of fire to reach each other. Every lyric carried history. These were not written stories. They were living ones, sung to keep memory alive. Each clan had its own verses, but when the bards met, they sang together as one, creating a tapestry of Dardanian pride that no empire could erase. As the tempo quickened, dancers took the stage. They moved in circles around the sacred flame, feet stamping in complex rhythms, shoulders swaying, arms raised to the stars. The dance was not random. It mirrored the cycles of nature, the turning of seasons, the eternal bond between gods and men. Young men and women often met for the first time in these dances, their movements a language of courtship older than words. By midnight, the entire gathering had become one living song. The fires burned high, sparks spiralling into the black sky like prayers. The echoes of drums rolled through the valleys, reaching even the shepherds on distant peaks. In those moments, the Dardanians felt immortal. Their voices joined in a harmony that no storm, no war, no passing empire could silence. When the last echoes of the drums faded, the dancers stepped into the firelight. Their movements were not simple entertainment. They were prayer, story, and prophecy. The dances of the gods were the most sacred part of the Dardanian festival, said to bridge the world of mortals and the divine. Every gesture, every turn of the hand or step of the foot mirrored an ancient myth passed down since the dawn of their people. The dance began with the circle of creation, performed by women dressed in white linen embroidered with red spirals, symbols of life and rebirth. Moving slowly around the sacred flame, they traced the path of the sun and moon, invoking Prende, goddess of love and renewal. Their arms rose and fell like the rhythm of the seasons, and the crowd joined in, chanting softly in the old tongue. The circle represented harmony, the unbroken bond between tribe, nature, and God. Then came the dance of the Thunderer, led by warriors in wolfskins. They stamped their feet in powerful rhythmic bursts, mimicking storms rolling over the mountains. Spears clashed, torches whirled, and sparks flew skyward as the men called upon Eng, the god of war and lightning. To outsiders, it looked like battle, but to the Dardanians, it was devotion, a promise to defend their land as fiercely as the gods defended the heavens. As the tempo quickened, men and women danced together, pairs weaving in intricate patterns, symbolizing balance between strength and beauty, passion and peace. Children tossed flower petals into the air, the scent of mountain herbs mixing with the smoke of the sacred fires. By midnight, the entire gathering became one vast circle, thousands moving as one under the stars. It was said that during this dance, the ancestors themselves joined in, invisible feet echoing in the earth. The fires reflected in every eye, and for a moment, the living and the dead, the human and the divine, were bound in the same eternal rhythm. When the dance ended, silence fell. The only sound was the crackling of the sacred flame, the heartbeat of Dardania, still burning strong beneath the endless mountain sky. With dawn's first light, the music softened and the festival turned toward the most sacred of its rituals, the rites of fertility and renewal. These were not simple celebrations of harvest or birth. They were ancient vows to ensure the balance between earth, gods, and people remained unbroken. The Dardanians believed that every seed, every newborn lamb, every drop of rain was tied to their faithfulness in these rites. At sunrise, the priestesses of Prende, goddess of love and fertility, emerged from the temple tents beside the sacred flame. They wore wreaths of wildflowers and carried bowls of milk and honey, offerings to awaken the life hidden in the soil. Men and women gathered in silence as the priestesses poured these gifts upon the ground, chanting words so old that even the elders only half understood them. The earth, they said, listened best when spoken to in the language of the gods. After the offerings, young couples came forward, betrothed or newlywed, to receive blessings for fruitful unions. The priestesses tied red threads around their wrists, a symbol of protection and enduring life. As the drums resumed, the couples danced barefoot in the grass, circling the sacred fire while the crowd clapped and sang. Their movements were mirrored by the fields themselves. the dance of love and growth, mirrored by the eternal dance of the seasons. Children, too, played their part. They carried baskets of grain and scattered seeds into the wind, an act both playful and divine. The people believed these seeds would find their way into fertile soil, ensuring a rich harvest. Even the warriors took part, washing their hands in spring water to cleanse themselves of blood and prepare for peace. At midday, the priestesses raised their hands to the sky and called upon Depatur, the sky father, to bless the land with rain. When a breeze stirred or clouds began to gather, the people cheered, proof, they believed, that the gods had accepted their gifts. The rites of fertility were not about indulgence, but harmony, a recognition that every heartbeat, every stalk of wheat, every child born beneath those mountains was part of one endless circle. For the Dardanians, to honour life was to honour the divine. As the final night of the festival approached, the fires that had burned for days began to dwindle. The air was heavy with the scent of pine smoke, roasted meat, and the faint sweetness of spilled wine. It was time for the farewell to the flame, the closing rite that marked the end of celebration, and the return to daily life. Yet it was not a moment of sorrow. For the Dardanians, this ending was also a renewal, a promise that the god's fire would live on within every home, every hearth, every heart. Before dawn, the high priestess approached the sacred fire that had been kept alive since the first day. Around her stood the tribal elders, their cloaks lined with wolf fur and bronze clasps gleaming in the light. The priestess raised her staff carved with spirals, symbols of eternity, and spoke to the crowd. She thanked Depatur for his strength, Prenda for her blessings, and Eng for the courage that bound the tribes together. Then she declared that the flame must now return to the people. One by one, each tribe stepped forward carrying clay lamps and torches. From the great fire, the priestess lit them, speaking blessings for protection, fertility, and peace. The tribes bowed as they received the flame, holding it high while chanting in unison, a chorus that rolled across the valleys like thunder. The light of 1,000 small fires spread across the hillsides, shimmering like stars fallen to earth. As the sun began to rise, the great fire at the centre was finally allowed to die. The priestesses covered it with earth and flowers, sealing its ashes beneath stones engraved with ancient runes. The people wept, but not in grief. They wept because the moment was sacred. What had united them under one sky would now live within each household across Dardania. Before departing, the bards sang one final song, a slow, haunting melody about life's eternal cycle. Children laughed, oxen were yoked, and the tribes began their journeys home, carrying both the god's flame and the memory of their unity. As the last smoke faded into the mountain air, the land of Dardania returned to silence. Yet beneath that silence, the sacred fire still burned, unseen but eternal.